I wasn't supposed to be at that bar. My coworker had insisted on celebrating the completion of a difficult project, and after declining twice, I finally agreed to stop by for one quick drink before heading home. The place was crowded, filled with music loud enough to drown out ordinary conversation. As I waited near the entrance for the hostess to find our table, my eyes drifted toward a quiet corner booth, and the world seemed to stop. Sitting there was my wife, Olivia. Across from her sat a man I had never met. They weren't reviewing paperwork or discussing business. They were leaning toward each other, laughing softly over candlelight, completely absorbed in their own conversation. Then he reached across the table, took her hand, and she smiled in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in months. My heart pounded, yet strangely, I felt no urge to shout or confront either of them. Instead, I stood there for several seconds, accepting that whatever explanation might exist, the trust one thought we shared had already begun slipping away long before I walked through that door. I slowly approached the booth. Olivia noticed me first. The smile disappeared from her face so quickly that even the stranger looked confused. She stood halfway, struggling to find words. "Ethan, this isn't..." she began, but stopped before finishing the sentence. I didn't ask who the man was. I didn't accuse anyone of cheating or demand an explanation in front of a room full of strangers. I simply looked at Olivia, reached for my left hand, and slowly removed my wedding ring. It had rested there for nearly 13 years. I placed it gently on the table in front of her without saying a single word. For a moment, nobody moved. The music continued, glasses clinked around us, and conversations carried on as though nothing unusual had happened. I turned, walked calmly toward the exit, and stepped into the cool evening air. Behind me, I heard Olivia call my name once. I kept walking, not because I hated her, but because I realized I no longer wanted answers shouted across a crowded restaurant. When I arrived home, the silence inside the house felt heavier than ever before. I made myself a cup of coffee even though it was nearly midnight, then sat in the living room thinking about the years we'd built together. I remembered our wedding day, buying our first home, and countless ordinary evenings that had once made life feel wonderfully predictable. I also remembered the recent months, the unexplained late meetings, canceled weekends, growing emotional distance, and conversations that always seemed to end with one of us saying, "We'll talk later." Later had finally arrived. Rather than acting out of anger, I spent the rest of the night gathering financial records, organizing important documents, and scheduling an appointment with my attorney for the following morning. I wasn't preparing for revenge. I was preparing to make careful, informed decisions. Sometimes the hardest step isn't leaving a painful moment behind. It's accepting that the future you've imagined may no longer exist. At 6:42 a.m., my phone rang. Olivia. I let it ring until voicemail answered. Then another call came. Then another. Finally, a text appeared. "Please come home. You don't understand who he is." Before I could even consider replying, another message arrived from an unfamiliar number. It read, "My name is Daniel. I was the man at the bar. Before you make any permanent decisions, I think you deserve to know why your wife asked to meet me." I stared at the screen, surprised. Seconds later, another text appeared. "I wasn't there to start a relationship with her. I was there because of something that concerns both of you." Suddenly, the certainty I'd carried out of that restaurant began to feel far less certain than it had only a few hours earlier. I agreed to meet Daniel later that morning at a quiet coffee shop, but only because I wanted to hear the facts before making any irreversible decisions. When I arrived, he stood immediately and introduced himself. "I'm sorry for how everything looked last night," he said. Daniel explained that he was an attorney specializing in estate planning and business succession. Olivia had contacted him several weeks earlier after learning that my father's health had begun declining. She wanted confidential advice about restructuring our finances and updating legal documents before surprising me on our upcoming anniversary. Because she feared spoiling what she believed would be a meaningful gift, she arranged to meet him outside his office after business hours. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were draft estate planning documents bearing both our names and emails confirming several appointments. Looking at the paperwork, I realized I had mistaken one moment, hand-holding included, for the entire story. Daniel admitted he had briefly taken Olivia's hand after she became emotional while discussing my father's condition. From across the room, it had appeared far more intimate than the context revealed. When I returned home, Olivia was waiting in the living room, still wearing the same clothes from the night before. Her eyes were swollen from crying. Before she spoke, I placed the folder on the coffee table. She looked at it and immediately understood that I had met Daniel. "I should have told you," she whispered. "I wanted everything to be a surprise, but I kept choosing secrecy instead of honesty because I thought the outcome would justify it." I nodded slowly. "Walking into that restaurant and seeing you hold another man's hand after months of emotional distance." I paused, searching for the right words. "You have to understand what that looked like." Tears rolled down her face. "I do now." She admitted that preparing the legal arrangements had consumed so much of her attention that she'd unintentionally become distant, canceling plans and avoiding conversations whenever she feared accidentally revealing the surprise. Good intentions, she realized, had created circumstances that looked impossible to explain. Over the following weeks, we spent far more time talking than we had in the previous several months combined. We even attended counseling, not because either of us believed our marriage was broken beyond repair, but because we wanted to understand how easily silence had replaced communication. I admitted that I had allowed one painful moment to define an entire narrative before asking a single question. Olivia admitted she'd convinced herself that secrecy was harmless because it served a loving purpose. Our counselor reminded us that trust depends not only on honesty but also on avoiding unnecessary misunderstandings whenever possible. A surprise that requires repeated deception carries risks even when the motive is generous. Likewise, conclusions reached in moments of intense emotion deserve careful examination before becoming permanent decisions. Neither of us left those conversations believing we were perfect. We left understanding that strong relationships require clarity as much as affection. Every anniversary since then, the wedding ring I left on that restaurant table reminds me of how close we came to ending our marriage over assumptions and incomplete information. People who hear the story often expect it to be about betrayal. Instead, it became a lesson about perception. From where I stood that night, everything I believed seemed obvious. From where Olivia sat, she thought she was protecting a heartfelt surprise. Both of us were certain, and both of us were missing important pieces of the truth. Looking back, I don't regret walking away from the bar to avoid a public confrontation. I do regret believing that one silent moment contained every answer I needed. Sometimes appearances really do reveal painful realities. Other times, they hide complicated truths that deserve patient conversation before irreversible choices are made. The wedding ring eventually returned to my finger, not because we forgot what happened, but because we chose to rebuild our trust through openness instead of letting one misunderstanding become the final chapter of our story.